It's my distinct honor to welcome you to the first presentation of the bi-monthly ARCIC Distinguished Speaker Series, sponsored by Director ARCIC. The Distinguished Speaker Series invites professional communicators and academics to present on a range of topics that stimulate professional discussion and debate relative to the Army's future land warfare environment. By employing the vast knowledge and experience of some of the best thinkers, educators, and practitioners of history, technology, and warfare, the ARCIC team is afforded a unique opportunity to broaden our creative thinking and problem-solving skills, especially with regards to the concepts and capabilities development and integration. The ARCIC Distinguished Speaker Series fully supports the intent of the Army's Leader Development Program. In DAPAM 350-58, Army Leader Development Program, it states, today's complex operational environment poses a wide range of possible threats under chaotic conditions. This complex environment requires leaders that can perform across a range of military operations, guided by the doctrine of mission, command, and operating under the ideals of the Army profession. Accordingly, it is critical that the Army focus on the strategic end of developing military and civilian leaders to meet the challenges of the 21st century, and that's what we aim to do here. Today's guest speaker is Dr. Alex Roland, a 1966 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. Dr. Roland served in the United States Marine Corps, Semper Fi, sir, as a motor transport officer in Vietnam, and his tour was from June of 67 to June of 68 with the 3rd Medical Battalion of the 3rd Mardiv. Then he took his PhD in history at Duke in 1974. From 1973 to 1981, he was a historian of the National Aeronautic and Space Administration. After returning to Duke in 1981, he chaired the Department of History from 1995 to the year 2000 and held the Harold K. Johnson Chair of Military History at the Military History Institute, United States Army War College, as well as Dr. Leo Schefrin Chair of Naval Military History at the U.S. Naval Academy. Dr. Roland has been a visiting professor at the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies at the Air University and the Department of History at West Point. His books include, but I'm sure not limited to, as he's currently writing a new one, it's Underwater Warfare in the Age of Sail, Model Research, the National Advisory Committee of Aeronautics, 1950-1958, the Military Industrial Complex, and with Richard Preston and Sidney Weiss, Men at Arms, A History of Warfare and its Interrelationship with Western Society. With Philip Scheiman, Strategic Computing, DARPA, and the Quest for Machine Intelligence, 1983 to 1993. And with W. Jeffrey Bolster and Alexander Kaiser, The Way of the Ship, America's Wartime History Re-Envisioned, the year 1600 to year 2000. Dr. Roland is a past president of the Society of the History of Technology and vice president of the Society of Military History today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Alex Roland.
And as a prelude, let me first of all thank General McMaster and all of you who have participated in bringing me here. I'm very happy to be here. I didn't realize I was going to be the inaugural lecturer, so I'm even more honored and intimidated by that role. I want to mention something at lunch today with Colonel Ivanov. I was describing how I came to be talking about the particular topic I'm going to talk to you today, and he said, be sure and tell your audience about your insight on this. I'm writing a book called Technology and Warfare for Oxford University Press in their series called Very Short Introductions. You may have seen them in the bookstore. They're small little format books. They're 35,000 words, and the challenge to the author is to explain a complex topic in 35,000 words, and I'm doing the whole history of human warfare from sticks and stones up to the day before yesterday. And it's a challenging enterprise, and I spent the last academic year at West Point, and I had an opportunity that I've never had before, and that was to teach a book and write a book at the same time. So I'd already outlined the book in a proposal to Oxford, but I hadn't started writing it yet. And in the spring semester, I designed a course called Technology and Warfare, and I used my outline of the book as the outline for the course. And the book is 35,000 words, and we had 40 class meetings. So every day after class, I wrote 1,000 words. And what I have is 35 separate essays now. They sort of hang together, but it doesn't work exactly well. But the positive part of the experience is, as an author, when you sit alone in the room with a blank sheet of paper, your imagination starts to play tricks on you, and you write things that you think are perfectly clear, but that aren't clear at all, of course. But when you have to go into a classroom and talk to a bunch of cadets who are very sharp and very cynical and not particularly interested in being in that classroom, you have to do some mental gymnastics beforehand to say, how can I take this message and make it interesting for them? And if you do that 35 different times, you get 35,000 words, which is what I have. And when I came home this summer and read through my 35,000 words, I realized that some parts were clearer than others. And so I'm using this talk as a way to literally talk through one of the problems I have in the book. What I'm going to talk to you about is one of the things that is central to what I want to achieve in the book, that is explained to an educated lay reader how to think about technology and warfare through all of human history, and provide some concepts that they can use to understand this huge conceptual glob I'm putting in front of them. And one of the most difficult things to do, I have found, is to explain what I'm going to try to argue to you. And as I was saying to Colonel Ivanov, in my home institution at Duke University, we have a writing program because most of the students who come to Duke cannot write. This is no longer surprising in any American university. Our high schools aren't preparing students well for college, for writing and reading, I hate to say. And so the director of our writing program is gifted. He runs a seminar for the faculty. And when I went to the seminar to learn how to write better, all the other faculty members I saw there were the good writers. That is, all the faculty members who weren't good writers don't go to the seminar because they think they can write. And all of the people who were accomplished writers were ones that knew we're always struggling with clarity and getting our message across. And that head of that writing program has a wonderful phrase which I've used over and over again. He will tell students that they are in the neighborhood of a good idea. And you know what that means? You're sort of bouncing around the streets and you know the place you're looking for is here someplace, but you can't quite put your finger on it. And his argument to them is, it is not enough to be in the neighborhood of a good idea. We've all been in the neighborhood of good ideas, and they're brilliant in our minds. But his point is, until you can articulate it so other people understand it, you don't have control of the idea. You haven't got to the home you're trying to go to. And so you will be dismayed to learn that I'm here fumbling around in the city streets with a good idea, and I'm not sure I'm there yet. So this exercise was as much for me as it is for you. So my subject is, I want to emphasize, it's about warfare and technology, which is what my book is about. But then the second part of this title, it's about change over time. And this is what historians do. This is what we specialize in, identifying, understanding, and explaining why things change over time. And particularly, in this case, I'm trying to explain how warfare and technology change over time and what's the relationship between them. So I'm going to do this by proposing to you two hypotheses that on first blush, I think, will seem mutually contradictory. One is that technology of warfare will drive change in warfare more than any other factor. It is the primary driver of change, has been through all of history, and I will argue will continue to be for the foreseeable future. But technology does not determine the outcome of warfare. And you would think if technology is the engine of change, it will also be the engine of victory. It will be the way to win. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But that second proposition, that it will lead to success, doesn't always follow from the first. So I'm going to discuss both of these propositions, try to convince you that they're true, and then I will discuss at the end what I think the implications of these are. All right, so the first proposition, technology will drive change in warfare. Think about how and why warfare has changed since, pick your date, 1944, 1864, 1066, 732, 330 BC. All of you history buffs will recognize those dates. The people who were conducting war at those times had no idea what warfare was going to be like in the ensuing time. And the people in 1944 didn't even imagine the kind of warfare we're experiencing today. And the bad news is this will continue. We cannot predict what warfare is going to look like in the future. We cannot predict the technological change that's going to take place in the future. But we can, I think, point to some historical patterns from the past that will likely continue in the future. And that's what I wanted to do with you, see if I can identify any of those patterns from past technological change and change in warfare. And the best framework for doing this, I think, and this is what I want your feedback on, is I want to use something as old-fashioned as the principles of war, but I've discovered they're not old-fashioned at all because the Army is still using them, and in fact the whole Department of Defense is still using principles of war, which of course have a very long history. Well, the principles of war, of course, aren't really principles of war, they're principles of warfare. So war is a state of being. It's organized armed conflict between states. And the principles are about warfare, about the conduct of war. That is about what it is that you do. And one of the statements that you can make about these principles of warfare is that they are unchangeable. And my authority for this is Antoine-Henri Baron-Jomini, who was one of the first in the modern sense of the terms of principle of war to identify them as a phenomenon. And even though he referred to the principles of war in his writing, he never articulated exactly what he thought the principles of war were, though scholars have gone back in his writing and extracted from them guiding precepts that they think he meant by principles of war. But Jomini says they're unchangeable. They're independent of the nature of the arms employed, that is the technology. The principles of war are independent of the technology at any given time, and that they're also independent of time and place. So to explore this proposition, what I want to do is take a look at the United States principles of war. Like most developed countries in the world, the United States first articulated formal principles of war after World War I, when all the nations of the world were trying to understand this new phenomenon of total war or total warfare and how it could relate to warfare as we knew it in history. And from those first principles articulated in 1929, they evolved over the years until 1949, when a list of 9 principles, these 9 principles, were articulated. And from 1949 unto the present, these 9 principles haven't changed. What is that, 64, 65 years? The principles have stayed the same. The only thing that changed on this list is the order of the principles, and the order didn't change very much. So why would it be that the United States purportedly believes this? These were first developed, by the way, by the Army, and all the services have since adopted them, and all the services adopted these 9 that were pioneered by the Army. Why is it that the American Armed Forces and the Army in particular think that these are the most important principles and that they are immutable? And why would they stay wedded to this set for so long? Now, interestingly enough, there's one new version which I just found recently, the ADRP 3-0. Do you all know this? Well, they've added 3 principles of war. Does anybody know what the new 3 principles of war are? After 65 years of these being adequate, we have 3 new ones. What would you imagine they are? Restraint. Perseverance. Good, good. What is the other? Legitimacy. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm delighted to hear that somebody knows this, that is, that somebody's paying attention to this, because the argument is that this is what a commander has to master to be successful in warfare. And I'm focusing on these principles because I'm going to ask the question, and you can see where this is heading. Has anything changed here? Do any of these phenomenon produce change? Well, before we get to that question, I want you to notice that these are all managerial, what I call managerial. That is, they are not material. There is no longer in lists of principles of war anything like weather, terrain, logistics, supply, which used to be parts of the principles of war. There's nothing like the direct command, take the high ground. We don't do that anymore in our principles of war. And note also that these aren't really principles. They don't tell you what to do. They tell you what to think about, so they constitute really a checklist. They are categories of analysis, and none of the categories is technology. Technology is not seen as a fundamental principle which can lead to success in warfare. In fact, there are no longer any material categories at all. And this holds true if you add the other principles of war that appear from time to time on other lists. Moral factors, friction and chance. You'll see Clausewitz heavily in here. Offense, defense, which is also a Clausewitzian concept. Center of gravity, which is sort of a quasi-material concept. That is, the enemy's center of gravity has something to do with where his forces are and how they're organized, but it has to do with more than that as well. And independent action or initiative, that's really anticipated by maneuver in the existing principles of warfare. All right, so as we consider all of these, which I consider managerial principles, these are the variables that govern how warfare functions. Jomini has a second observation that I want to bring to your attention. And please read that carefully. And notice when he says in the beginning, it's absolutely necessary to know that science. He means the science of conducting war. To know that science, which consists of a mixture of politics, administration, and war, it would be difficult to assign to it, that is the science, regular rules. In other words, we have principles of war, but the principles have no rules. Well, what kind of principles are they if they have no rules? According to Jomini, history is the only school that can teach you good precepts. That is, you get the rules from history and you apply it to this category of analysis. So these are, they're not principles, they're not scientific, they're checklists, categories of analysis, and the categories, says Jomini, are timeless and immutable, but you get from them no particular course of action. They tell you what to think about, not what to do. But To paraphrase Eisenhower, principles are useless, but thinking about principles is priceless. And that's the point of the exercise. These are the things that the commander is supposed to think about to be successful in warfare. For example, if you just take any one of them, and my favorite is mass, I just love this as a piece of advice, and this is from FM 3-0. Concentrate the effects of combat power at the decisive place and time. Brilliant. What is the decisive place and time? If the commander knew that, of course he'd be successful. And in fact, I maintain that this is entirely tautological. There is no such thing as a perfect place and time existing abstractly in space. The commander makes a decision. And if he was right, then after the fact, they say that was the precise time and place to apply. And if he loses the battle, they say that wasn't it. He missed it. There's no way to know. This doesn't tell you anything to do. It just tells you something to think about. So the best way to know what to do in each category, and this is according to Jomini and everybody else who's written on the principles of war, is first of all from experience. That is, the commander knows from his own military experience, his own combat experience, what to do with these variables. And also from archived experience, and this was Jomini's point, an archived experience is just what? It's history. It's the record of what other commanders did when they faced similar circumstances. And the other way to know what to do, and this too comes from Jomini, is just common sense. A lot of these principles are common sense. So note the implication here. The principles lead to success, and the Army still insists upon this, that you're supposed to master these principles and you will be successful in battle. And they do not change. They're timeless. So how does warfare change if these essential variables are timeless and immutable? They're not changing at all. Then what is changing? Technology. My argument is it's the only thing that changes. These things don't change. I'd like you to test this premise by a thought experiment with me. And the thought experiment is going to be that date I mentioned to you earlier, 330 BC. What happened in 330 BC? Well, that's when Alexander the Great conquered Afghanistan. No mean feat. And he conquered Afghanistan at the end of this campaign. He took over Macedonia from his father, probably by poisoning him. Then he conquered all the Greek city-states, and then look what he did. He conquered all of modern-day Turkey, Syria, the whole Levant, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, went all the way to India, through Afghanistan, Turkmenistan. Look at that achievement. It's remarkable. It's incredible. It's hard to imagine another commander in the space of time, hardly more than a decade, who achieved as much as he did. So he must have been one of the ultimate great captains. And if we're to believe Jomini, he must have understood the principles of war. And my question to you is, if Alexander came back to life today and we sent him off to Afghanistan to conquer it again, would he know how to do it? And the answer is, he obviously knew all the principles of war, and he'd mastered them. He knew the checklist, and he checked it all off, and he thought about each one of them, and he came to the correct solution in each one over and over and over again, hardly losing a battle in this whole campaign. And we could say this about all the great captains of history. And the reason they succeeded is that some of these principles of war are intuitive. You think of unity of command. Well, almost any commander wants to have unity of command, wants to have a hierarchical relationship with his or her orders spread down through the pyramid. Economy of force. You're going to use your forces as sparingly as possible so you don't wear them out and waste them. But some are also experiential. Security, for example. The Romans learned security the hard way. They would go out and campaign, and get ambushed by their enemies, the barbarians. And before long, they learned to build formal camps every night, no matter how much of a pain in the neck this was, to provide themselves with security. That is, it's experiential learning. The same thing with maneuver. You find out what your troops are capable of doing in the battlefield and what they're not. But nothing in Alexander's intuition or experience could prepare him for, make up your own list, satellites, airplanes, explosives, computers, radio, precision-guided munitions, whatever it is. He wouldn't have a clue what to do with those tools. He wouldn't know how to integrate him in his operational plans. He wouldn't know how to invent an operational plans with those technologies at his disposal. And what's worse, he couldn't learn quickly. He couldn't learn very soon. And we don't realize it, but we all carry around what historians of technology and others, sort of sociologists of technological enterprise, call tacit knowledge. That is, we understand things about the way technology works that we don't consciously think about anymore, but we're so familiar with the technology and what it does in our day-to-day lives, we have a deeper understanding of it than we really know. We might not know the technical details, but we know something about what satellites are and where they're moving around and what their orbits are like and what their capabilities are. We know something about why airplanes fly through the air and which ones can hover in space and which ones have to keep moving quickly. All of us have a considerable amount of tacit knowledge about this technology, and it would be a black box to Alexander and all of those other commanders that we talked about in history. Charles Martel in 732, or William the Conqueror in 1066, or any of the Union and Confederate generals in the Civil War, they wouldn't have known anything about any of this, and they wouldn't have been able to learn it very well. So if you're talking about how warfare is different than it was in their time, the only thing that's really different is the technology. All of the rest of the basic principles are the same. So my point is, the most important variable differentiating warfare today from warfare at any other time in history is technology. And by extrapolation, I would suggest to you, the thing that will differentiate warfare today from warfare 20 to 30 years from now will be technology. All the other principles are timeless and immutable. Now, you may ask, and I want to take a little time for question and answers and have you test me on this, but haven't I missed some variables that have greater impact? Personnel is one you always think of. You know, today's soldiers are smarter and better educated and all the rest. But so are the enemy soldiers smarter and better educated, and all commanders have always had to deal with taking the personnel resources they have, training them as best they can, and comparing them to get some kind of comparative, preparing them for some kind of comparative advantage over the enemy. How about logistics? There's a wonderful book called The Logistics of the Macedonian Army, and it's a study of the logistics of Alexander's campaign. He understood logistics. He did that whole campaign route I had up here with the logistic technology available to him at the time, and never ran out of supplies and the resources he needed, the material resources he needed for his campaign. In fact, he was a genius at logistics. How about rules of engagement? We're in the world of modern international law and formal rules of engagement, and all the services have them and whatnot. But I would argue to you that throughout human history, all soldiers in warfare have had rules of engagement. Every society that has ever fought has had a set of rules of the game for how they fight people like them and how they fight people who are unlike them. That is, how they fight the barbarians. And those rules aren't as sophisticated as our rules, but they were clearly understood. They were a kind of tacit knowledge, and you tried to break the will of people like you and kill the barbarians because you cared not for them. And all was fair in the way you fought the barbarians. You could only kill people like you in certain well-defined ways, even in primitive society. Well, the good news of this proposition is that 20 or 30 years from now, warfare is going to be just like it is today, except for the technology. And the keys to success are going to be the same, and you just have to keep going through the checklist like we are doing now. But the bad news is the technology is going to change, and the warfare is going to be different. And unfortunately, there is no good way to predict what that technological change will look like. All futurists have been wrong as often as they've been right in trying to predict the technology of future warfare. Well, can't we, you ask, use directed research to prepare the technology, the military technology of the future, so that we can shape the future and it won't be so random? Well, the problem is, of course you want to stay on the cutting edge as you understand it, but you can't guarantee that your research will pan out, and you can't guarantee that your adversaries won't ambush you with unanticipated technologies because they're developing different technologies than yours. There is still, of course, a high correlation between research and development and battlefield success. And the test of that, I always ask my friends who think some enemy has some advantage over it, would you want to trade arsenals with any other country in the world? No. The United States has always had the best across the board, the best military technology, at least from the beginning or early in the 20th century up to the present day. And we want to keep fighting that way. We don't want to give up that advantage. Superior military technology does not ensure military success because war is a two-party game. So we keep developing the best technology we can, but everything that we try to do, some adversary is trying to stop, and that greatly complicates this issue of directed research, and it means that the goal is a moving target. We can't know a fixed environment into which we're going to put our new technology because we don't know what the enemy's going to do. And a case in point for that proposition is the revolution in military affairs, which I want to talk about next. And I might add, what I'm going to say now is not particularly new and original. General McMaster has written about this on more than one occasion very effectively. But my point here is going to be that superior military technology will not necessarily determine victory. And you remember that's my second major point, which I think is intuitively at odds with the proposition that military technology is the primary driver of change in warfare, but it won't guarantee success. Okay, the revolution in military affairs began, interestingly, it was an American phenomenon, but it began with the Soviets in the 1950s, in the years after World War II. And they were worrying at the time about the impact of nuclear weapons on warfare. And they developed a theory which they called a military technical revolution. And they maintained that such a revolution was underway and that it was going to reshape warfare. It was going to change warfare, as indeed it did. And this concept of a military technical revolution guided their development of their military technology, both nuclear and conventional, through the ensuing years. But as they got into the 1970s, they changed the focus of this debate about a military technical revolution. They were less concerned now about the impact of nuclear weapons on conventional war because nuclear strategic weapons had sort of drifted into their own category of strategic standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. And everyone was reluctant to use battlefield nuclear weapons, even though both sides were developing them, for fear that they would escalate into strategic nuclear warfare. So the nukes now seemed somehow or other a separate category, but the Russians, the Soviets, shifted their concern to what they saw as a growing disparity between the quality of American conventional arms and the quality of Soviet conventional arms. And in making this observation, they were just doing the same thing the United States had been doing. And in many ways, it was a result of World War II. Both the world wars had been wars of industrial production. That is, the side with the most stuff won. We overwhelmed the other side with stuff. But there was a perception after the war, because of the hothouse of military innovation during the war, that the next war might well be determined, the outcome might be determined by the quality of the weapons. Not the quantity, but the quality. And for that reason, the United States began a consistent campaign of research and development to improve military technology across the board. All the services did it. And the Soviets had the same perception, and they were doing the same thing, but they just weren't as good as we were. So the quality of our military technology generally, they came to believe by the 1970s, was superior to them, to theirs, and they believed that the gap between the two was growing, and they believed that if the gap wasn't closed at some point in a foreseeable future, the United States would move to a plateau, to a different level of capability from not only the Soviet Union, but all the rest of the world. And nobody would be able to contest with the United States in conventional warfare. Well, this began to attract, the United States intelligence community followed this literature because this was all open literature. It was theoretical literature by Soviet military leaders and by civilian defense intellectuals in the Soviet Union. It was published open literature, and we were following it all. It started to catch the attention of the American defense intellectuals in the 1970s. And one of the reasons was we were winding down in Vietnam, or after 73, we were really in the aftermath of Vietnam, and we knew that we had not done well in Vietnam. And interestingly enough, the Army had a better appreciation of this and was less in denial than any of the other services. And they devoted themselves to rethinking their relationship with technology and what kind of technological capabilities they had. And out of that, in the 1970s and into the 80s, we developed air-land battle, and especially perhaps precision-guided munitions. Those were two of the major initiatives to come out of this rethinking of American military relationship with technology following Vietnam. And these innovations, like air-land battle and precision-guided munitions, started to be sold in the 1970s with an American version of what the Soviets had already been arguing. And what the Soviets called a military technical revolution, the Americans came to call a revolution in military affairs. And they picked up the Soviet point of view and said the United States now has the capability to move into its own category of conventional war capability by having superior technology to any other country in the world. This argument appealed to this man, Andrew Marshall, who was at the time the head of the Office of Net Assessment. He was a defense analyst, one of the defense intellectuals out of the RAND Corporation, and became the first and still only director of the Office of Net Assessment, which was created in 1973 by one of his former analysts at RAND, who became Secretary of Defense. And Andy Marshall made it his special argument within the Department of Defense that the United States should not concentrate on its great strength, that is the ability of its technology to deliver firepower more effectively than anybody else in the world. He thought that that was our hobby horse. But instead, we should think about who our adversaries were. And the way to plan for war in the future is not to beef up your greatest strength, but to target the enemy's weakness. And to his mind, the debate about a revolution in military affairs seemed to fit exactly that possibility. In other words, because the Soviet research and development system could not keep up with us in research and development, we should play to that strength, which plays on their weakness. And so he commissioned a study of the revolution in military affairs in 1993. And that appeared at the time of just an explosion of literature in the 1990s on topics that fit neatly under this umbrella of the revolution in military affairs. And you can see what they're called, the electronic battlefield, the perfect war. I can remember when the perfect war came out. Boy, that was just the hottest new appraisal of what had gone on in Vietnam and what the potential was for the future. Limiting the fog of war, the precision revolution, which is about PGMs, of course. And this explosion of literature brought the revolution in military affairs into the public domain and into the policy domain in Washington. Now, what did they mean by their revolution in military affairs? Well, there's no hard and fast definition of it. It meant different things to different people. Andy Marshall just thought it was precision-guided munitions. Other people thought it was an electronic battlefield. It was all kinds of things. But the distinguishing characteristics were the same. All of the people who wrote on the RMA said it was not about nuclear weapons, but it was about America's qualitative edge in conventional weaponry and military technology in general, which allowed us to counter the Soviet-Russian numerical superiority of conventional forces in Europe. And the claim was then made explicit. If we pursue the RMA actively enough with sufficient research and development, the United States will reach an unassailable plateau in which we will be invincible to all, and they used language like this, including the Russians. And this sort of campaign, and it was literally a campaign, sort of reached critical mass in 1994. And there were many reasons for that. The first Gulf War was one of them, when there were indications of what this new electronic battlefield might look like. The Office of Net Assessment Study came out in '93, and that contributed to it. Perhaps just as importantly, President Clinton was cutting back on defense budgets in 1994, and everybody in the Pentagon was looking for more bang to the buck. And not least important, Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense, became a devotee of the revolution in military affairs, and that was to have perhaps the most important impact of all, because, and these are the characteristics that led to that, because in 2001, of course, Donald Rumsfeld returns to the office of Secretary of Defense in the George W. Bush administration. And as they entered office, he and his president had two primary military goals that they wanted to achieve in office. President Bush wanted to field a ballistic missile defense system. Remember that that had been in development since Ronald Reagan's Star Wars speech of 1983. And here we were almost 20 years later, and we still didn't have an operating system, and he wanted to get that system in place. And Donald Rumsfeld, the returning Secretary of Defense, who had been Secretary of Defense in the 1970s, had honed his own appraisal of the military establishment and considered that it was, he believed that it was preparing for the last war. And he wanted to introduce what he called defense reform, and he was going to introduce defense reform under the banner of the revolution in military affairs. And so before too long, something appeared that came to be called, he didn't give it this name, but came to be called the Rumsfeld Doctrine. The press really gave it that name. And the Rumsfeld Doctrine consisted of increasing reliance on high technology, greater use of standoff weapons, especially air power, beginning of campaigns against adversaries with air power shows of shock and awe. They actually use that title. Fewer boots on the ground, that is, less ground soldiers, and nimble fighting forces. No more of these Cold War armies with their big heavy tanks and armor and all the rest preparing to fight the Soviets on the plains of Europe. We were going to have this new army, and all of it was going to be made possible by the revolution in military affairs. Does this sound familiar? It sounds like the day before yesterday, doesn't it? We've seen this movie before. So what happened in Iraq? Of course, he introduced that even before the 9/11 attacks, and clearly before we started the war in Iraq. But you can see where his thinking was. And the result, when we went into Iraq in 2003, was what? Well, first of all, as Secretary Rumsfeld liked to say, we went to war with the army we had, and it wasn't up to snuff, but nonetheless, the RMA was going to save it. But he insisted he did not need the hundreds of thousands of troops that General Shinseki suggested might be required to pacify the country. We did indeed begin the campaign in 2003 with shock and awe. The result was that we rolled over Saddam Hussein and his army and rolled into Baghdad in no time at all. And what's the conclusion? The RMA worked, right? And if you look at the summer 2003, that was the conclusion being drawn by all the advocates of the RMA. And it did work until what? That. Simple little thing. This one isn't quite so simple, but it's the same idea, and you get the point. Simple technology, trivial little technology, not high technology. And of course, this didn't win the war, but it kept us from winning the war, right? It kept us. It was a classic case of mission creep, and the goals changed and everything, but the war did not end the way we wanted it to end, and we did not have the military capability. Now, you can argue, and it's no doubt true, that this was a political problem, not a military problem, but still, the Bush administration believed that the military was going to give them the political solution they wanted because our military capability was going to be so overwhelmingly effective, and it didn't work out that way. Well, how did this happen? Technology can be decisive. High technology can be decisive. The reason we should keep the arsenal we have and the capability we have is that it can be decisive when the enemy responds symmetrically. In other words, if the enemy is building the same kind of army we're building, we can build a better one than the enemy can, and our army will work. And this is what happened with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. We were just better at this stuff than they were. Saddam Hussein in both the Iraq wars. What was he doing? He was trying to fight us with our weapons suite, right? He was trying to fight us with our style of warfare, and we were just much better at it than he was. Israel had the same success against the Arab states. They tried to fight them with the same conventional weapons. The Israelis got a lot of their weapons from us. The Arab states got a lot of their weapons from the Soviet Union. It was a walkover until what? The Intifadas. It is when the enemy fights you asymmetrically, then that arsenal you've put together may not be as effective. It might still work, but then again, it might not. But we've seen, this was not the only example, we've seen countless instances of asymmetric responses since World War II. Think of the Chinese Civil War, Mao leading a peasant army against Chiang Kai-shek's Western-funded and supplied conventional armed force with tanks and trucks and airplanes and all the rest. And who wins? Mao invents a whole theory that he calls People's War, of how you use low technology to defeat an industrialized armed force, to defeat high technology. And his People's War was the same thing that Ho Chi Minh used to defeat the French. Think of Dien Bien Phu. How in the world did they get artillery up to Dien Bien Phu? Well, they took them apart and carried them up on pack animals, and nobody in the French army ever imagined that they could do such a thing. Well, if you are outgunned and you can't play on an equal basis with your adversary, you pick alternative ways of fighting. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese used the same tactics against the United States in Vietnam. They were right out of Mao's lesson book on People's War. How did Al-Qaeda attack the United States? Box cutters. Who'd imagine box cutters? All our elaborate intelligence operations, all our security operations and whatnot, and they figure out that they can take over a plane with box cutters. Who'd have thought? Well, we wouldn't think because we rely on the high technology, but they thought about it. And the IED in Iraq. These were all instances, my point is, not that one technology was better, but that the high technology side fell into a hubris about their own superiority and the superiority of their arsenal. And the reliance on that superiority led to failure. So what went wrong with the RMA, with the Revolution in Military Affairs? Well, in my view, they began with a question, which is good, and that's really what the principles of war are. They're not answers, they're just questions. What are you going to do about security? What are you going to do about intelligence? What are you going to do about mass? What are you going to do about maneuver? They're questions, and you have to answer the question. They tell you what questions to ask, but you have to figure out the answer. So the Soviets were asking questions, and the RMA ended with a dogma. It was almost a political statement. And it was the same hubris. In fact, they said that the new high technology, the revolution in military affairs, would be decisive. The same horrendous language that the Air Force used in World War II to talk about strategic bombing. And it wasn't decisive, but they convinced themselves that it would be. And the advocates ending up believing what they wanted to believe. And they didn't test their dogma. They didn't try it out to see if it was true or not. Rather, they made evidence and experience fit the dogma instead of the other way around. Okay, so those are my two propositions. Warfare will change because of technological change primarily. There are some exceptions to that, and if you want to try me on them, I'd love to go at it. But primarily, technology will change the nature of warfare in the future, but superior technology by itself will not guarantee that we'll be successful. Okay, so what are the implications of this? I just had a wonderful session with General McMaster and wanted to just throw out this whole section of my talk. It's so naive compared to what you all are doing here, but bear with me for a moment to think of this as the longue durée. This is what the French historians like to say. We're looking at the longue durée, the long course of history. The 5 implications of these two propositions for you, I think, who are trying to think about the future of warfare for the Army and the American military establishment in general. First of all, expect change in the future. Expect it to be driven by technology. Expect the United States to be at the forefront of the high technology. I don't think we're going to give up that premier position anytime soon. But also keep in mind that there will be other changes driven by other technologies. And where our adversaries cannot compete with us in high technology, they will use alternative technologies. And to be prepared for the battle in the future, you have to be prepared not only with what you think you're going to do, but what you think the enemy is going to do. So you got to get out of your mental framework and get in the enemy's mental framework. What would I do if I were in that position? Excuse me. I also suggest that you prioritize your missions by type. In other words, I don't know exactly how your planning works, but it seems to me that you or some other group in the government has to think about all the different kinds of threats that are out there to the United States and how those threats are going to change over time. And they will all change, I suggest, because of technological change, but you have to think of them in the different realms. So for example, weapons of mass destruction, how are they going to change? Are we going to have significant changes in nuclear weapons? We already see some states, we're getting a little more proliferation now than we've had in the last 30 or 40 years, so you have to think of other state players. Same thing with chemical and biological weapons. What changes are you expecting there, and what kind of threat will they present? And then the same, of course, with conventional warfare. And here I would suggest that you not ask about who. Say, are we going to fight North Korea in a land war in Asia, or are we going to fight the Soviets in Eastern Europe? But what kinds of threats and conventional warfare will the United States face? And my guess would be not very many, because if we do face threats in conventional warfare, we always win the conventional wars. Nobody's going to fight us that way. So it's important we have to maintain that capability, because if we lose the capability, then somebody will challenge us, but that's probably lower down on your priority list. And then unconventional or asymmetric challenges, and what will be the nature of them, and what goal will the enemy have? Will the goal be to seize, occupy, and defend territory, as ISIS seems intent on doing? Or will it continue to be what it's been, I think, since Vietnam, which is to inflict casualties on Americans, American soldiers and American civilians? All right. Third, develop new technologies based on these likely missions, what you think this future threat environment might be. And from reading your documents, I've come across an entirely new term that I hadn't encountered before. In fact, I didn't even think it was a word. I thought you made it up, but it actually goes back to the 14th century. Overmatch. I think overmatch is a wonderful term, because it puts the emphasis not on any particular capability, but on a capability relative to potential enemies, and that's the most important part. Not what you can do absolutely, but what you can do against particular enemies. So it's a very nice concept, and I recommend that you continue to think in that kind of way. I think that's very new and fruitful and helpful. And remember to include non-weapons technologies, that is robots and computers and vehicles and communication and medicine and all the rest, because these will be important in our capability to overmatch our enemies overall. I also recommend that you consider dual-use technologies, because I think they'll be more important in the future. And as you saw from those pictures of the IEDs, dual-use technologies are dangerous because the enemy can get them. The enemy can get box cutters and cell phones and all the rest, but we still have the advantage in that we innovate faster than the rest of the world. So our dual-use technologies will generally be better than their dual-use technology. Fourth is red team all your innovations, and I'm sure you're familiar with this. I'm probably preaching to the choir, but ask your very best people and your severest critics, somewhat, to come in and critique what you think you want to do from the enemy's perspective. If we do this, what will the enemy likely do against us? What weaknesses will they find? Will they attack us where we're not expecting them? Will they try some asymmetric response? And adjust your technologies accordingly. And finally, develop doctrine. I've learned from General McMaster, you all are doing all this stuff. But do not assume, as the RMA advocates did, that your new technology will guarantee victory. To succeed, your commanders must weigh all the principles of war, just like Alexander did, just like all the great captains have done through history. You must pay attention to all of those categories and not get beguiled, seduced by your latest technology, because if you focus on the technology and don't pay attention to the other things, you will fail. So, my takeaway is technology enhances what you can do, but it should not dictate what you will do. Technology gets you in the game, but it's all the other principles combined that will let you win the game. And technology is the game changer, but the principles, all of them, are the game winners. And we should not be seduced by our high technology. And to avoid that, I recommend, once more, Jomini And the answer that Jomini prescribed is historians. Would you believe it? We historians are the source of the accumulated experience of all the warriors through all of history. And by seeing what they did with the principles of war, you can get ideas. Commanders can get ideas what to do with the principles of war, and that includes what to do about technology.